Welcome. I'm Laura Lee Binstock, and this is a Trauma Survivor Thrivers podcast. Thank you again for joining me for my first ever live show on Fireside Chat. I am your host, Laura Lee Binstock. And the purpose of this show, if you haven't listened to it previously, is to highlight trauma survivor thrivers and the beauty of post-traumatic growth. I know this is an interactive audience. This is my first show. And so I'm learning and getting my bearings. So I know I'm trying to figure out how to bring everyone in. If you do have a question, please feel free to ask. My guest today is Shannon Moroney. And if you are interested in asking a question, please raise your hand. Like I said, this is my first time actually doing the show on this platform. So I will try to get everyone up on the stage to ask Shannon any questions that you might have. Shannon is a best-selling author of 2 memoirs, Through the Glass, her own story following the violent crimes committed by her first husband, and Out of the Shadows, the story of human sex trafficking survivor Timea Nagy. I hope I'm saying that right. I felt like I was reading, I was hearing it different ways, and I actually read or listened to the audiobook, and it was amazing. Both books are amazing. Shannon, she's also a trauma therapist and a clinical director of Shannon Moroney and Associates, currently providing treatment, support, and advocacy for dozens of survivors of disgraced fashion mogul Peter Nygard. He's currently awaiting extradition to the U.S. on a 9-count sex trafficking and racketeering indictment, while also on trial in Canada for similar charges. Shannon is also the author of Heal for Real, a guided journal to forgiving others and yourself, which was just released last week on January 4th. And you can, if you see that fortune cookie, it says bestselling author, and you can actually click on it and you can actually go to her website where you can purchase these books. They're fantastic. I read all 3 during the break. But Shannon, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thanks, Laura Lee. I am just delighted to be here.
Well, I'm delighted that you were my first guest just on the platform and in 2022.
It's awesome. I'm delighted as well. Just coming to this new year with nothing but hope. What else can we have?
That is the theme, hope. And, one of the things I really wanted to focus on was fluidity. Like, I realized that things are going to have to change, when we least expect it. And honestly, for this whole week, I was expecting my children to potentially not have school. And luckily they are. So they're, everything's okay. But yeah, I think fluidity and hope is what we need for 2022.
Oh my goodness. Absolutely. I mean, as I broadcast to you and this beautiful audience, I am in isolation with a very mild case of COVID.
I'm so sorry.
No, it's okay. I'm triple vaxxed. My kids all of our schools are closed here in Toronto. So it's just, living the dream.
Right. We're just moving along with it. We're just moving along with it.
Exactly. But I'm thrilled to be here and start about and talk about all these really important topics. And I just thank you so much for that introduction about the beauty of post-traumatic growth. Yeah.
When you're really in it, you don't realize that there's post-traumatic growth on the other side of it all. And I think highlighting that is extremely important. So people know that we don't have to sit in the mess that we feel like in some ways we've created, but honestly, that's not true. And I think, you say forgiveness is the new F word. And I think a lot of it is forgiving ourselves for what we've put ourselves through. But we will get to that when we talk about your book, Heal for Real, which I'm very excited about. But first, I want to kind of talk about you and your personal story, which you write about so eloquently in your first bestseller, Through the Glass, which 1 month into your marriage, you found out that your husband had kidnapped and raped, allegedly raped 2 women. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, it wasn't alleged, that's for sure, because he had actually called 911 himself and asked the police for help right after he did this. And so, in the instant that a police officer showed up at my hotel room door, we lived in a small community a couple of hours north of Toronto in Canada. And I was in Toronto for a conference. I was a high school counselor at the time. And the police officer came to my hotel room and he told me what had happened. And he said, your husband is in custody. And he called 911 himself. And he's given a full statement that is an exact match to the statements of the victims. And so I had really a split second only to think that there was some mistake. And then as soon as he said that, I knew that there was no mistake at all. And the next thing I was told was that he would be likely a candidate for our highest sentence in Canada, the dangerous offender designation, which would mean the rest of his life in prison because he had an offense from 18 years ago, 18 years before. So in this, so he was already on his second chance, a second chance that had been, I think like the best second chance that anyone could have. And to all eyes and everyone's knowledge that knew him from, professional folks that supported him being and living safely and successfully in the community as he had for years, to me who lived with him every day. We just could not fathom that he was capable of what he had proven himself to be capable of on this nightmare day in 2005. And then my journey at that moment, of hearing this from the officer was to basically lose all the beautiful and proud titles that I'd carried the previous day. So respected educator, volunteer in my community, happy newlywed, homeowner. All of those things were essentially torn away from me by what he did. And I was given a new title, wife of a sex offender. And my journey became almost instantaneously and over the following years, and sometimes even until today, there we still have moments of you don't forget. I mean, you always carry with you what happened to you. But my journey became to get out from under that label and reclaim the labels that properly belonged to me, which were of respect and not of guilt by association.
Wow, the trauma of betrayal seemed enough for you to actually deal with, but from what I read in your book, you were vilified for being the spouse of someone who committed these violent acts. How did that affect you in ways that other people could not see? Because I feel like a lot of people do place so much judgment on others without really knowing what those other people are going through. How did that affect you and how you reacted?
Oh my gosh. It was like waking up from a nightmare to find that you're in a nightmare in a nightmare. People who are, when we look at earthquakes, for example, the greatest attention gets paid to the primary earthquake, but we actually know that the aftershocks can be absolutely just as damaging. So for me, having this horrific stigma applied to you, an immediate judgment of so many, not everybody. And I want to really just shout out to my beloved people and all the people on this planet who are non-judgmental, who have compassion, and who do things for people in crisis, like what was done for me, dropping off a small lasagna, a card that says, I'm thinking of you. I'm here for you. Those are the things that ultimately allowed me to be where I am today. But it was certainly because, well, I mean, those acts of kindness and compassion and non-judgment are the antidote to the opposite of those, the judgment, the shaming, the exclusion, shunning, even, and even the full, vilification. The worst aspect of that for me was losing my job, and having my principal, my superintendent, tell me that I would be moved to a school outside of our town, like a literal shunning. Get out of here. We don't want to see you. We don't want to deal with this. And because ultimately we'll believe you're guilty by association, and being told by them in the most fragile state I could possibly find myself in, having, have my home become a crime scene, in absolute agony for the victims who the police immediately told me I could not have any contact with, even though all my family and I wanted to do was offer to help them, support them. We were just immediately told, like, you're on the side of the offender. And, the absolute heartbreak of losing everything about the life that I'd built and planned for, to, hearing from my employer, that I represented something terrible. That's what they said. You represent something terrible, Shannon. People are saying, how could you be a good counselor when you were married to this man? And don't come back in this school. It's too upsetting for everybody. And we'll just move you outside of town when your doctor says you're ready to come back to work. And that character assault and attack, exclusion and shunning, was what really led to my PTSD diagnosis. And then I wasn't well enough to go back to work for a long time.
Right. I can't imagine. How do you, especially with all the shunning, everyone telling you that you are guilty by association, how do you face people? How did you?
Well, yeah, I mean, it was winter when this happened, and I know listeners are probably from all over a place, but our winters here are very long, very cold, very dark. And so I actually felt safer for a number of months because I could literally hide myself with scarf, hat. It's interesting. I'll interrupt myself to say that many of the survivors that I support now, in a pandemic where you have to wear a mask, have actually reported that it makes them feel a bit safer because they cannot be identified. And if they can't be identified, they can't be judged. And that is so painful that anyone who's been in trauma, anyone who's, a victim of someone else's choices, would have to feel that fear of judgment. And I'm working really, really hard to change that. But for me at the time, I sort of, muddled along with the support of family and the friends that really stuck by me. And when it came to be spring, I started to feel really exposed and afraid even more. And ultimately, what I knew I couldn't live in my small community. I'd also lost my income, my husband's income. I put my house up for rent, and somehow in the midst of all of it, I mean, we do find adrenaline in survival. I managed to write an application to complete a master's degree in social work. I thought a little bit about it before all of this, so it wasn't just an out of the blue thing. And then apply for a scholarship, and which I won, and I was able to move to England to study for a year. And that's how I had to remove myself from the physical space that was really unsafe, that my community, and be able to go and put my mind to work on something that felt productive and that was going to, in one way or another, help me try to make sense of the senseless. And as an educator, I just I actually realized everything that I'd always told all of my students was true, which is that education opens doors. And it's the best gift we can give to ourselves. And when I had doors slamming in my face, and all of that closed to me, I just knew I had to try to open as many doors as I could. And so I educated myself further.
How did you heal from this? I'm assuming, what were your emotions towards your husband? I'm sure that they evolved from when you first heard to now. But what is that like right now?
Yeah, well, okay, well, I'll get to the right now part in a second, but at the time, I think most people really expected me to be filled with anger, absolute rage. And that's often the expectation of trauma survivors, or whatever way we have been victimized, is that you're incredibly angry. But in my own experience and what I even learned about Jason, my first husband's victims, when I later heard their stories in court and had a chance to speak with them, was that the primary emotion is usually heartbreak. It's absolute profound sadness at the idea, not only the idea, but the actions that someone took to hurt you. And the realization of somehow the place that they must have been in to be able to do that. Mm-hmm. And so the sadness and heartbreak and grief was absolutely overwhelming. And a broken heart can't hold anger very well, not for long periods of time. So my anger came about a year later. I mean, it would bubble up, and there's a scene in my book where I do get really, really angry. And, I find out that Jason had a credit card that I didn't know about. And it was almost as if that was a tangible thing that I could get angry about, because it was almost smaller. Mm-hmm. It was a smaller crime compared to what he had done. But, and the biggest stuff was beyond anger for me. It was just beyond it. Anger came about a year later. And that when it hit me, it hit like a tidal wave. And it wasn't only anger at Jason and what he had done. Most of my anger for Jason was just that he hadn't asked for help, that I didn't have a chance. It was helplessness. I didn't have a chance to stop this. Mm-hmm. But my anger was also then at the justice system. It was at my employer. It was at the people who excluded me and who had judged me. And it was an absolutely flooding, terrifying anger. And fortunately, you asked me about how did I get through this? I have my heroes, my golden circle. Some of my family members, my parents, and I have my family doctor was one of the only people who she stepped in right away and said, I'm going to help you through this. Okay. I'm going to help you through this. And she offered me she said, you can have one of two types of prescriptions. I can give you a prescription for something that's going to help, kind of numb some of your emotions right now. Or I can prescribe you something that's going to help you get them out in a really safe way. And that's going to be art. Now this is a very, renegade, GP, and exactly what I needed. It was the prescription of exactly what I needed. Was a safe way to let out these emotions so that they didn't poison me from the inside. And I started making some of the ugliest art that there is.
I doubt they're ugly.
They're let's say powerful.
Yes.
Powerful. And that is what helped, was the safe space of understanding, opportunities to let out my feelings without judgment, be allowed to go in and out of grief to anger, to hope, to, just sometimes even just fantasy thoughts of like how they're going to find a cure for what's wrong with him and everyone's going to be okay, to, back to grief and cycling through all of that. So how I got through it was with support. There wasn't enough support, I can say, and that's what I've dedicated my own life to, is being a provider of support and care and advocating for a lot of changes in the justice system and mental health that would allow everyone to have non-judgmental and sustained support. And then a lot of it was resilience. I was probably in the best place in my life when this happened to me. So my tank was pretty full. So I was able to, propel myself through a lot of it. But the tank runs out. And I think that's when things got pretty hard for me. Not that everything wasn't, it was just different phases of hard and awful. But I would say the gift that I'm maybe most thankful for in myself is just that I really love life.
Yeah.
I really love life. And I just knew somehow from the beginning that Jason was going to be sentenced to prison for the rest of his life. But I was going to have a choice about whether or not I would be sentenced to a personal prison, a psychological prison, an emotional prison of anger, resentment, rage. And I didn't want to be. Mm-hmm. And even if I didn't want to be for me, I didn't want that for my parents. I didn't want that for people who love me. And that's what pushed me forward, was that resolve.
Wow. And you also began speaking out and actually telling your story and to other families and reaching out to other families who had been through similar situations, and even those who are on the other side of it. What did they want to say to you when they reached out to you? What did they need from you, and what did you need from them?
Well, it's a little bit different. I actually, when I decided to tell my story, when I decided to speak about it and write about it, it was really because I think it was Maya Angelou who said, but I could be wrong, so forgive me, that said, if there's a book that you really, really need and you can't find it, then maybe you're supposed to be the one to write it. Mm-hmm. And this was my experience. I could not find anything about what it was like to be the family member of an offender or family member of a sex offender. No one was talking about that yet. I would look at the numbers and realize that I, in Canada, am part of a group of 12,000 families and acquaintances and friends of people who are incarcerated. And in the US, 2.5 million people are incarcerated. And then let alone all over the world. And so I started thinking, but all of these people have families. All of them, no one is without someone that was in their life that is probably going through some degree or another of what I'm going through as well. And I wanted to find those people because I needed to belong. That's what lets us out of stigma, is when we belong. And peer support, as a therapist now, I always say it, the gold standard is individual plus group therapy. And peer support is what lets us know that we're normal in abnormal circumstances and that we're not alone. So because I couldn't find anyone myself, I found one person in an online group, and she and I really supported one another. And her husband was incarcerated as well. She, like me, we had a lot of other things in common, as well as the big trauma. We like to scrapbook. We like to chat on the phone. And that was really, really helpful to have one person that I could talk to. But ultimately I wanted to reach many more. And so I wrote my book, and that is when, there was a lot of media that surrounded it. And so that's how the word got out. And then it was just a flood of people contacting me to say, in our own version of a Me Too.
Yeah.
And that's what led to a lot of the work that I do now. I support lots of family members of people who have offended in my therapy practice, and certainly in the advocacy work that I do. And in the big case that I'm involved in, as you mentioned, in the Nygard investigation, there are family members there that need someone who understands the nightmare that they are in as well.
Yeah. And I do want to talk about your second book, which is Out of the Shadows. It's your second best-selling book, which is incredible. January 11th, just this past a couple of days ago, it was Human Trafficking Awareness Day. And you wrote this book with sex trafficking survivor Timea Nagy. How did this collaboration come about?
Yeah, well, the interesting thing was before I guess I found out that I could write with writing through the glass, and I had a wonderful, wonderful editor. But I'd never been a writer before that. I would tell myself, but I actually had written because I'm so old that I'm pre-email, and I probably wrote hundreds of letters to people when I lived overseas. I lived in Ecuador, I lived in Indonesia, I travel a lot, and I just wrote hundreds of letters. And when you're in a foreign land, and you want to share it with your experience with people who aren't there, you learn to describe things very well. And so when I wrote Through the Glass, I was in a foreign land, the land of crime and jails and courthouses and all that. So I found myself being able to write about it. And then, so just really on the writing side, as well as with my, I think, emotional awareness and intelligence, as well as justice system knowledge. My editor at Penguin Random House introduced me to Timea Nagy because she had heard Timea speak and share her story, knew that her story needed to be in a book so it could reach, thousands and thousands and thousands of people, but also knew that Timea wasn't a writer. She's a wonderful, wonderful storyteller, but also that English is her second language, that she learned from watching Friends reruns when she escaped her traffickers in Canada. So my editor asked me if I could meet with her. And she actually had said, could you just talk with her about writing a book and that all the benefits of writing a book and putting it out in the world. Now, I'm not going to lie and say it's a roller coaster ride when you go public. It's a roller coaster. And you get, gosh, I could probably rhyme off some of the horrible, terrible things people felt it was their right to say about me. Whatever meeting me and online and in whatever. Hopefully I'm almost over that 10 years later, but and you just have to focus on all the wonderful, wonderful support that there really is. But that's what my editor wanted me to talk with Timea about. And so I did that. And I thought that my job was to kind of convince her that it could be a really important thing for her to write a book. And that was successful. We hit it off really, really well and had a great conversation. And I went home and I texted my editor on the way home from our coffee date and said, okay, job done. She will talk to you. She will talk about writing a book with you. And my editor texted me back and she goes, okay, great. Can you do it? And I was like, what? You bamboozled me. But ultimately I said yes and wrote Timea's book for her after interviewing her extensively for hours and hours and hours, going through her work, researching and so on, and wrote her a book. And our books become the tools that we need as advocates to educate others and make things personal. Because if we only see media that is statistics or cold hard facts, or we certainly know the way that media can present survivors as sort of nameless and faceless and even, put them up for judgment. Now Timea and I both have our personal stories that people can really connect to on a human level. And when we connect and we feel empathy, then we want to change things.
Yeah, when I read it was such a well-written book, very heart-wrenching. There was just, and I've interviewed sex trafficking survivors, and I've educated myself, but just her story, just reading the details.
Yeah.
and her response to the manipulation that went on. And, you know, it was really hard to listen to, because I did listen to it on Audible. But it was, thank you for helping her share that story, because I felt like I learned so much from it. And you're also working with other sex trafficking survivors. What got you into that advocacy work?
So after writing Timea's book, I mean, it's absolutely heart-wrenching and gut-wrenching to read it or listen to it. It was absolutely heart-wrenching and gut-wrenching to write it, because you really, really, to write in first person for somebody else's story, you have to be able to put yourself in their shoes. Or as I used to say to Timea, because she and I both have when you're in the trauma club, sometimes you can get dark humor. And, you know, I used to say, I'm putting myself not in your shoes. And they're like, you know, the 6-inch stilettos that you were forced to dance in for 16 hours a day. So that's where we had this sort of joke about stilettos and me walking in her stilettos. But it truly was a very painful experience. And I learned a lot about self-care, and trauma retriggering and vicarious trauma from doing that. And I learned most of it the hard way. So I've got some great self-care practices in place right now. Absolutely. And I'm a lifetime participant in therapy, as probably we should all be anyway. But after the book came out, you know, you sort of ask yourself, okay, what next? You know, and I really wanted to get back to my first love of counseling. I'd been doing a lot of counseling in a lot of different ways over the years. I had started several years before that leading retreats and workshops about forgiveness, because that was something that just kept coming up for the people that I worked with, or the questions, you know, from family members of sex offenders, from survivors of sexual assault, was, you know, what about this big thing, forgiveness? I'd been doing lots and lots of speaking, so I continued to do all of that. But at the same time, I reopened or let's say formalized my work as a therapist, and registered with the College of Social Workers. And then my practice was about part-time, and I did all my other work, speaking, writing, and workshops and so on, the other part-time. I also, during this time as well, had, because of the possibilities of post-traumatic growth, I had gotten remarried, and I had twins. And so my twins were still pretty little. It's a lot, everything happening all at once. So, but at any rate, at the beginning of, I had a lot of people coming to me. I mean, all of my therapy clients come to me by referral, and they very often come to me through my book. So or through Timea's book. So just naturally, that's kind of the clientele that will come to me for those treatment for those specific experiences. And then when the pandemic hit, a couple of things happened right away. The first was I had to stop traveling. So I lost all of the work that I'd been doing in person, which was about 50%. My husband lost his job, and our kids were sent home from school. So that's the story of a lot of people. But then what immediately happened, and this all took place within the same 12 days, I received an email from an organization in the Bahamas, a nonprofit group supporting survivors of sexual assault. And they had just reached out to me through Psychology Today, through my profile there, and asked me, and they said, we have a couple of women from Toronto who were in the Bahamas. They were sexually assaulted here, and we would like to pay for their therapy back in Toronto. Do you have room in your practice? We found you online because of your expertise. And I said, of course, yeah, actually I have nothing but room right now because of all these changes. I said, sure, no problem. It was only when I contacted the first of these two survivors. I mean, first of all, I learned that neither one of them lives in Toronto. If you don't live in Canada, not that many people know Canadian geography all that well, so that's okay. But at any rate, it was only in my first conversation with the first survivor that I realized that her assailant was Peter Nygard. And I actually had not heard of the civil class action lawsuit that had been launched against him just a few weeks before, mainly because most of the news was about COVID. Mm-hmm. And I'm not a big news watcher anyway, because you probably know this, Laura Lee, when you're a trauma survivor and you're really sensitive to violence, you make a lot of choices about what you can consume on TV, what you can't, and so on. So I've just never really been a big news watcher.
Right. It's self-care.
It's 100%. And also when you're involved, as I am, and all of your work involves gritty and true crime, it's not entertainment in any way. So at any rate, I had missed all that in the news. So I was speaking to this first survivor, and she was absolutely terrified, mistrustful. She said to me, "How do I know you're not a spy for Peter Nygard?" Mm. And that was the first I heard his name in anything. And when I like I said, I just didn't know anything about how or when this person had been assaulted. So in the background, she's talking to me. I'm trying to ground her a bit, and I'm going, "Oh my gosh, what is happening?" And I Google in the background Peter Nygard, and that's because I'm thinking Peter Nygard, that like of the Nygard stores, the like polyester clothing for senior women, like that's what I'm thinking. I'm like, what? And so when I Googled, that's when I found out everything, and I thought, oh my God, this is one of his survivors. And then I called the other person. Same thing. And then over time, I think very quickly, a lot of women and girls were coming forward at that point, because that's the very, very good thing that media can do, is break a story that tells people you're not alone.
Yeah.
You are not alone. And there's actually someone you can talk to. There are lawyers, there's law enforcement, there's therapy. So that's when I just began to be referred literally dozens of women, and many of whom were girls at the time of their assault. And because I'm a natural born advocate, but also because my profession as a social worker, we are called to advocacy. That's part of our mandate. And our advocacy means that we are always making sure our clients have access to information, resources, they know their rights, and they can make informed choices. So that's when I got involved in letting these girls and women know if and where they could report their crimes criminally, if they had any interest in joining civil case, and so on. And then from there, things just evolved into participating in some media to be a voice for them, and kind of everything that I'd gone through in my life, personally, professionally, everything I knew about trafficking through Timea came together to the role that I'm in now. I often think of, you remember the pilot who landed the plane on the Hudson River?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And I remember him saying that he just felt like everything in his entire career had prepared him for that 1 minute and 30 seconds.
Right.
And it's a way I identify with, I think, the role that I'm in now, working to support these survivors as both their therapist and advocate, media spokesperson, working really hard to bring a more trauma-informed approach by lawyers, law enforcement, media, and so on, and standing up for what just is not right.
Right. Wow. Yeah, I one of my previous guests, Dave Scatchard, he's actually an NHL center for the Vancouver Canucks. Mm-hmm. He said something that was so poignant about how he asked God, why am I going through all of this? He went through early Alzheimer's just because of all of the hits he took playing in the NHL. And he said that God told him that it was because it was to prepare him to help the people he was going to help, because he was not going to be able to understand them unless he went through it himself. And I thought that was a really incredible way of looking at it, because we all struggle, and I think that there's a reason to we have something greater than ourselves that we are there to, it's to prepare us. And I think what you said was poignant as well. And
absolutely, and this is what a lot, with so many of those survivors that I'm working with, and certainly in my own journey, it's, what happened is senseless. But when we can carve out some kind of purpose from it, we are able to get usually to a place of acceptance. Acceptance of, I didn't ask for this in my life. There's nothing that I did to bring this to me, but that there is something that I can do with it. And often people have a spiritual component, or, I'm not in any way a religious person. I left the church that I'd been born to because I had a lot of problems with patriarchy and abuse, and it just was not an institution that I could have anything to do with as an institution. Right. But I had a friendship with someone I call God, and I'm like a fair weather friend, or like a crisis friend. I'm a terrible, terrible friend to God, because I only go to God when I'm begging, or I have two prayers. One is please, 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 please. And the other is thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. And, in my early conversations with God, on my own journey, and I remember having them sometimes from inside a closet where I would just cry and cry and cry. And I remember this conversation that I had pretty soon after Jason's arrest, and I had not spoken to God for a very long time. And I just said, I'm like, okay, we're going to make a deal. I'm not going to ask you why. I'm not going to ask you why this happened, because I know there is no answer, and even you don't have an answer for this. But I am just going to ask you what you want me to do with it. And I'm going to ask you for the strength to do it. And I can only be, I'm in the thank you, thank you, thank you part of my prayers, because that's, I think, what I was able to do. It wasn't easy, but to be in a place now where I get the privilege of helping other people find their way and make some sense of the senseless, there's nowhere else I would rather be. And don't get me wrong, I'm on my knees a lot with the please, please, please. For sure. I don't think there's a lot of people who aren't at this point in our world and in our lives. And it doesn't matter if you're religious, or you're talking to God, or you're just, feeling the air around you. It doesn't matter. But when we're at that place, we often just want to know that there's maybe something bigger than us that's going to provide support. And then we see those earth angels around that show up to say, hey, I'm here for you. And that's incredible.
Yes, absolutely. And before I definitely want to touch on your recently released book, Heal for Real, a guided journal to forgiving others and yourself. It's not a memoir, but such a helpful guide for healing. Why did you decide to write this book and the format? Because it is a journal. It's basically a prompted journal. And I love that, because sometimes we open up the journals and we just say, okay, well, we'll just write. But I love that it's guided. Can you talk a little bit about that?
What I love about a new notebook is the cover and the first page, and then I get completely overwhelmed by like a blank journal for me is like, and I'm a professional writer. I mean, that's so I'm like, I need to start with fill in the blanks, circle the word, that is how Heal for Real, the guided journal to forgiveness starts. Heal for Real is really like, for me, the sister of my memoir, Through the Glass. Through the Glass is my journey to figure out what forgiveness means and doesn't mean for me, because it sure doesn't mean saying what happened was okay.
Right.
And then how to apply it and how to live with the commitment to seeing humanity behind the horror and letting myself off of the hook of a lifetime chain to resentment, anger, bitterness, blame, self-pity, self-hatred, all those things. And so Heal for Real, though, is your story. It's the story of of everyone who picks it up and takes a pen or pencil crayons to it, and who wants to figure out, in a guided and supported and cared for safe environment of a book with my voice and the stories of so many other people, to figure out what forgiveness means and doesn't mean to you, and all the options for how you'd like to apply it in your life at a pace that's okay for you. You get to rage in the journal. You get to cross stuff off. You get to scribble. You get to write. You get to understand what forgiveness means to a whole bunch of other people and draw from their experiences to figure out what it means for you. And so I wanted to bring this to the world. Like we just need it so much. And again, when I had to stop traveling to lead forgiveness workshops and retreats, which are always transformative, and I've led them in hotel ballrooms, at conferences in big cities, and I've led them on the land in the Arctic, where I washed my hair with snow and had the privilege of working with Inuit survivors of residential schools. And people are the same. That's what I love, is that we're the same. When we connect on our brokenheartedness, we connect on our hope, we connect about the pain that we're in, we're raw and we're real and vulnerable, we can heal. We can start from that place to heal and find support and find community even. So I was doing all of that work in person. And then when the pandemic hit and canceled all of it, I thought, okay, here's my pandemic project. What I had long wanted to do anyway was put all of my curriculum that I developed over the years with my partner in crime prevention and fellow author Katie Hutchison, and put it into a format that people can use from home, because everybody's at home now.
Right. Yeah.
And also, we're going to need a lot more forgiveness when you're either in complete isolation, and you may be in isolation of the heart as well, or you are now with the same 2 or 3 people all the time.
Yes.
Everywhere. So, not everywhere. In one place, rather. So that's where Heal for Real came from. And it was just a joy, an absolute joy to work on it. It was kind of healing for me. I wrote, because as I just described to you, a bit about how my day-to-day life looks like with, not only dozens of survivors of Peter Nygard and that huge investigation, but the other half of my practice, which is, people in all different life situations, and my kids at home and all this stuff. So I got up and wrote, usually at 4:30 or 5 in the morning when no one can interrupt you. And it was a beautiful, and it's like an experience of self-care as well, to be able to write it. And now it's just a joy to get it out to everybody. And so that forgiveness can be something that is accessible to everyone in the right way. It's not going to be left as a philosophy for monks in monasteries, whom I love. But sometimes, those of us who are maybe living lives, most of the rest of us who are living really incredibly busy lives where everyone needs us, especially as women, that we might also be able to access the philosophy, the intellect, the spirituality, of forgiveness, and then the practicality of it. How do you do it?
Yeah, you do call forgiveness the new F word. And I know for a lot of people, the idea of forgiveness, it can incite some anger depending on, how you're in your healing process, I guess, from trauma, if you have even started that process. Like, how do I ever forgive my abuser? I'll be honest, I was one of those people. My story, I'm obviously I for many people, they know I'm a childhood sexual abuse survivor. I was abused as a child by my father, and for the longest time it was just so much anger. I was so angry, and just the idea of someone saying forgive was just crazy to me. But I did one of my way of healing. I did psychedelic assisted therapy, and in my journey, I realized that my father had gone through his own trauma where he didn't understand. He didn't, he had his own trauma, and that the abuse wasn't to hurt me. It's just something that, that kind of, he just didn't understand, where there was abuse throughout his childhood. Um, so I like to think about when after that I had a little more compassion towards my father, but I'm not going to call him and say I forgive you or even have a relationship with him. But I feel like, I guess, if you're saying that forgiveness can mean so many things to different people, I feel like in a way it was more understanding. Um, and so for other people who are like, well, why should I forgive my abuser or forgive this person who victimized me? What do you say to those people?
Mm-hmm. Well, you put it so very well. And I want to take a moment to thank you for sharing your story and to acknowledge your journey and the pain that you have gone through, as well as your superhuman strength of finding compassion, and being able to put yourself in your father's shoes, even for a moment, and come to the realization that hurt people.
Mm-hmm.
Because that is a huge entry point to forgiveness. When we can consider the idea, the concept of, what if the person that hurt me, the person who abused me, the person who murdered my family member, the person who, or the institution that created laws that did this to my people, what if that was them doing their best in that time?
Mm-hmm.
And it's a radical way of looking at things. When we do that, sometimes the first thing we feel is pity. Like, how unbelievably sad that for whatever reason, that person thought that the best thing they could do was pull a knife. The best thing they could do was create a law that excluded people. That's the best that they could do. And so if we even sometimes start with a place of sadness and pity, that's it. That's how shut down that person was. That's how hurt they were. That's how ignorant they were. That's how righteous they were. That's how privileged and powerful and racist or whatever they were. That's sad. Mm-hmm. And it's never that we're going to let them off the hook for what they did. That's one of the biggest mistakes, I think, that when people kind of bristle at the word forgiveness, it's that there's this concept of like that means that someone's going to get away with it. That means that we're pushovers. we are weak. We are going to allow this to happen again. We're giving permission. We're pardoning. We're, all of those things. When what we're really, really trying to do in forgiveness is let ourselves off the hook. Let ourselves off the hook of the rage, resentment, bitterness. That we were hooked with, just like a fish on a hook, and now is stopping us from being able to breathe properly, find our own way forward, and that forgiveness also involves accountability, and that we may or may not ever get. You might never get it from your father, but you can restore your own dignity and your own strength by being that person of compassion with boundaries, right? By saying also, I forgive you because you could not do any better than what you did to me at that time. And I don't want to be in a relationship with you because of it. But I'm not going to let what you did to me dictate all of my decisions, relationships, emotions for the rest of my life. I'm not going to do that. Mm-hmm. And the word that I'm going to choose for that is forgiveness. So,
wow. Well, thank you so much. Any parting words before we go?
Oh, just thank you. Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be able to talk about my favorite F word. And just wishing every person who's listening, that just wellness and strength on their forgiveness journey. Please reach out to me. Please pick up the book so you're not alone. And let's get out there and F it up.
Awesome. I love it. Thank you so much. I appreciate you joining me today and sharing all of the wisdom from so much experience, and just what you've done to move past all of this trauma and what you've experienced and to really help others. I applaud you.
Thank you so much. And the very same to you, Laura Lee, and every person who's listening, because everyone's listening because they also want to grow and change and be healed. And so my love to everybody.
Thank you. That was Shannon Moroney, best-selling author and author of the recently released book, Heal for Real. For more on Shannon, visit my website at tstpodcast.com. That's the letter A, tstpodcast.com. She also contributed to January's issue of Authentic Insider, which you can find at my website. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to my email list to get Authentic Insider magazine in your inbox monthly. You can also connect with Shannon at www.shannonmoroney.com. It's also scrolling across next to that fortune cookie. You can actually click right on that and it'll send you to her website. And her books are available everywhere books are sold. So be sure to check out Fireside next week. I'll be hosting 2 shows, Wednesday the 12th with author Karen Gross about trauma education, and on Thursday the 13th with Amy Guerrero with Thrive in Recovery to discuss trauma and substance abuse. You've been listening to a Trauma Survivor Thrivers podcast. I'm Lori Lee Binstock. Thank you for being a part of the conversation. Take care, everyone.